They state this, but his fandom is also in tension with some of Tolkien's ideas about how nation states should approach the outside world. The cope is real for so many who apparently don't like J.R.R. Tolkien and don't like J.D. Vance. When the worst thing that you can come up with for a political candidate is that they like J.R.R. Tolkien, I would say that the straws that they're grasping at are swiftly falling through their fingers. Here is what, okay, so I know it's really hard to believe, so you have to hear it from the horse's mouth. But here is what Rachel Maddow of MSNBC said is one of the problems with JD Vance, and how we know he's a white supremacist bad guy. Okay, it's hard to even explain this, so let's listen to it.
Like Mr. Teal, who has named his companies after things in the Lord of the Rings series of J.R.R. Tolkien books.
That's a good idea.
Lord of the Rings is a sort of favorite cosmos for naming things and cultural references for a lot of far-right and alt-right figures, both in Europe and the United States. Peter Thiel names all these things after Tolkien figures and places, like his company Palantir, for example.
Yeah, good name.
Like his mentor, like Peter Thiel, who had given him all his jobs in the world. Mr. Vance also, when he founded his own venture capital firm with help from Peter Thiel, named it after a Lord of the Rings thing. He called it Narya, N-A-R-Y-A, which you can remember because it's Aryan, but you move the N to the front. Apparently that word has something to do with elves and rings from the Lord of the Rings series. I don't know.
I don't know is the right thing to say, because clearly she doesn't know at all. The idea that, remember, Narya is Aryan. This is like the 80s evangelists talking about backmasking being the big problem. Oh, no. What I worry about is what people actually say. I don't care about running it backwards or switching around the letters in the word and making a new word and saying it's bad because it has those same letters in it. My goodness, the idea that Narya and Aryan are similar. Now, she's going to say she's making a joke probably, but there's a hint of truth in that. Narya, let's be clear, simply means fiery red in Quenya. And guess what? The ring has a red stone in it. It's red. So what is it called in the language of the elves? Fiery red, thus Narya. It has nothing to do with the N at the end of Arya. Ridiculous. Number two, then. Okay, so cope number one, right? Oh, okay, Narya. He's a white supremacist because it sounds like the word Aryan, or you move the N to the end. Number two is this article from Politico. They tried to make the point that Lord of the Rings, the horrible far-right fascist Lord of the Rings, shaped J.D. Vance's politics, apparently. And where does this all come from? Well, it comes from one quote from a 2021 podcast where he's asked, who's your favorite author? And he said, I would have to say Tolkien. I'm a big Lord of the Rings guy, and I think, not realizing at the time, but a lot of my conservative worldview was influenced by Tolkien growing up. And then he added he's a big fan of Lewis. He likes that era of writers. Of course, that era of writers is important because of the struggle, the difficulty, the pain, the anguish, the loss that they went through World Wars I and II. It was so visceral to them that they couldn't help write things from a conservative worldview. And I'll explain to you what I mean by conservative worldview in a little bit. So for them, right, it was simply the worldview. We had to abide by this. And so when he says my conservative worldview was influenced by Tolkien growing up, that's what he's saying. These people who struggled through so much, had to deal with so much, they saw right and wrong, good and evil in certain terms, or no uncertain terms. That was important to him. And so he names his venture capital firm. He named it Narya, the Ring of Fire, right? Remember Gandalf, he carried it. He said, I am a servant of the secret fire. Well, that fire means God. The secret fire. That is essentially what it's referring to. I think it's a cool. I name things. I played Red Dead Redemption, and I named my white horse Shadowfax. Right there's something us Tolkien fans like to do, and we take it from that. And then here's the funny thing, right? They interview some other people. They go through other people. They don't talk to this. They'd never talk to J.D. Vance. Why would you talk to the guy who made the quote himself when you can talk to a bunch of other people? And ask them about him rather than and create the narrative that you want to create about this vice presidential candidate, the person that will be second in command. Why ask him when you can go to people who have mildly interacted with him 5 years ago? They talk to everyone but Vance. And what do they learn from everyone but Vance? Well, he may have internalized a message, and she thinks this is where Tolkien did not want his work to go. And we have to be willing to learn from this. All this mealy-mouthed nonsense about projection onto a person based on simply him saying that Tolkien is a fan, or that he's a fan of Tolkien, is the worst possible journalism, right? Aren't you, as a journalist, you're supposed to get to the facts, come to the point, realize the truth of a situation, but they don't even want to pursue the truth because they have a narrative that they want to pursue instead. And this narrative is that Tolkien influences people on the far right into negative areas. And what does it mean to be far right? Okay. Remember, I talked about a conservative worldview. The conservative worldview boils down to one thing. And let's start with the things that he actually believes. She writes, or this is a Renee Girard said this at a Catholic University of professor, that he thinks it's fair to say that Vance believes there is real spiritual evil in this world, and it can become embodied in rites and rituals. Oh, okay. And that Vance likely took away from Tolkien an apocalyptic frame of mind, a final all-encompassing battle between good and evil. Right. You mean to tell me this is crazy, but that J.D. Vance believes what Catholics have believed for millennia? The billions of Christians have believed that is so shocking. You mean he believes the same thing they all believe too? Oh my goodness.
That's shocking.
And that's the conservative worldview. The conservative worldview is that there is good and evil. And when they say here in this article that J.D. Vance's politics are influenced by Tolkien, right? They're shaped by Tolkien. Well, they mean that he should, if they're shaped by Tolkien, well, then he should be against going after Ukraine because, that's a bad guy and we should be up against bad guys. What are we doing if we're not fighting the bad guy? Well, let's remember, in Tolkien, the bad guy is essentially Satan. I know, for those of you who know Lord of the Rings, Sauron is not the official Satan. That would be Morgoth, but he's the closest thing that they've got at this point because Morgoth is locked behind the door of night and is unavailable. So Sauron is now taking up the mantle of what Satan would be. So you are not just fighting for a land war in Eastern Europe in the Lord of the Rings. You are fighting against the great evil of the world. And it is the great evil of the world that must be fought against. Now, Tolkien believed that evil comes in many forms, and we see that in Lord of the Rings. We see that in Saruman. We see that in Caradhras, right? We see that in Old Man Willow. We see that in the orcs and trolls. Even the Hobbit, you could say those trolls. We see that, of course, in Morgoth and Saruman, right? There, it comes in many forms. But it is the great evil that must be confronted. You don't see the hobbits worry about Rohan getting invaded by Dunlendings or Wildmen. They don't care about land wars. What they care about is their home. And when their home is attacked, that is what they go after. And that, they could, this is obvious. If they really wanted to have an article that said, we are worried about what J.D. Vance believes, at least point out that the belief is based out of what Tolkien believed, which is that there is good, there is evil, there is one true God, and fighting against the evil that fights against that God and us, right? That evil that wants to dominate us, like Morgoth wanted to dominate, like Sauron wanted to dominate. That is the evil we must fight against. So when there is the domination of the world, right? That is what we are fighting against. That's why World War I and World War II, particularly World War II, right? That was a righteous war, right? There were people who wanted to dominate the entire world. That's what we're talking about here. But they don't talk to anybody else, right? Well, they got to talk to JD Vance about this. And I'm sure he would come to terms with them and say, look, this is what I believe. And this is how it influences my foreign policy. But what I believe is this, what I believe, what Christians have believed for 2,000 years, what Tolkien as a Catholic also believed. And it is ridiculous for them to make up an entire narrative that says he should be going into Ukraine for this. They make that point at the end of this article. They state this, but his fandom is also in tension with some of Tolkien's ideas about how nation states should approach the outside world. Because Tolkien was really writing about how nation states should approach the outside world, as if this author has any clue about what she's talking about. He writes, the books are in many ways anti-isolationist. Frodo wants to ignore the ill tidings and stay home, but eventually realizes the Shire isn't untouched by troubles elsewhere, like, say, NATO being pulled into defending Ukraine from Sauron Putin. Oh, so what have they learned from reading the Lord of the Rings? That Putin is now Sauron. In the end, Rohan, Gondor, the elves, right? Again, their story is about, we all have to come together, kumbaya, and we fight the big bad guy. Coming together was simply a byproduct. That had nothing, that wasn't the point of the story. The point was fighting evil. Their whole idea that he should be going after Ukraine, like how dare he be anti-Ukraine war, or anti-Ukraine funding as a Lord of the Rings. That's what, I mean, ultimately, that's what their point is in this article. And it is foolish, it is amateurish, it is creating a narrative they want to create because they have a political agenda rather than actually finding out the truth. And you know what the truth is? Why don't we read what Tolkien actually said when it comes to what the point of Lord of the Rings is? In a letter to Naomi Mitchison in April 1954, he wrote this: the story, The Lord of the Rings, is cast in terms of a good side and a bad side. Beauty against ruthless ugliness, tyranny against kingship, moderated freedom with consent against compulsion that has long lost any object save mere power. Beauty against ruthless ugliness, tyranny against kingship, moderated freedom with consent against compulsion that has long lost any object save mere power. That compulsion, mere power, that is the conservative viewpoint that they completely miss. This is what we are fighting for, a freedom based on truth and beauty and a pursuit of the one true God. That was point number one. Now, the other point in general about the whole story of Middle-earth and the story of the Silmarillion, Tolkien wrote this in a letter to Joanna di Bortitano in April 1956. He said, the real theme for me, it's kind of important to know what Tolkien said, is about something much more permanent and difficult: death and immortality, the mystery of the love of the world in the hearts of a race doomed to leave and seemingly lose it, the anguish in the hearts of a race doomed not to leave it until its whole evil aroused story is complete. Now, this is more the story, the entirety of Middle-earth and the elves story, because that was the overarching tale that he was telling from 1915 on, when he started writing his histories of Middle-earth. So it's a story of loss, of being doomed to leave the world, and how we as humans have the gift of death, where we get to be, where our the end game is for us to go to where we do not know, but to go to be with Eru Ilúvatar, the one true God. The idea that J.D. Vance has been influenced by Tolkien, yes, sure. What was he driven to believe by reading Tolkien? Well, when you read Tolkien, you realize, like what Tolkien says, the fight is beauty against ugliness, tyranny against kingship, freedom against compulsion. And they never mention any of that in here. They could have gone to Tolkien. What did Tolkien say about it, and how did that influence? They could have gone to J.D. Vance. They will not do that because they have an agenda, right? Because Tolkien to them means far right now. And we can't let them take it, but we can correct them and tell them where they're pretty much always wrong when they mention Tolkien. Like Rachel Maddow said, I don't know. And I think that's a good place for them to be. I don't know, so don't talk about it unless you actually decide to know. Thanks for listening. My name's Jonathan. We do a podcast exploring Tolkien. Look for that everywhere. We're going through The Hobbit right now in detail, and even going over Tolkien's 1960 attempted rewrite of The Hobbit. He had 3 chapters, and he abandoned it after those 3 chapters, but it's an interesting take on how The Hobbit might have changed after Tolkien finished The Lord of the Rings. Check that out. Give us a like, give us a subscribe. We appreciate you. And I'll catch you around as The Rings of Power is coming up. See ya.